President Trump, I think, is using the Alien Enemies Act, even though it is unprecedented, even though it hasn't been used in over 70 years, because it might allow for faster deportations. If he succeeds in court, he's going to say, I don't have to go through this one by one due process hearing for everyone we need to kick out of the country, and I don't have to reveal classified information. The problem there is, we're not in declared war, so is this an invasion? The Trump White House says it is. I'm not sure the courts are going to agree.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. The breaking news. The Trump administration refusing to provide a federal judge with any additional information about last week's deportation flights under the Alien Enemies Act, arguing the disclosure of the information would, quote, pose reasonable danger to national security and foreign affairs, end quote. This is ABC reporting. In a court filing and in a series of sworn affidavits by three top cabinet officials, the Trump administration invoked the state secrets privilege to attempt to stop U.S. District Judge James Boasberg from learning more information about the flights as the judge tries to determine if the government willfully violated a court order last week. This news is so fresh that it's a great pleasure to welcome John Yoo. John is a distinguished visiting professor of the School of Civic Leadership at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the Emanuel S. Heller Chair in Law and Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of California at Berkeley. Most importantly, he is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, as well as a fellow at the Civitas Institute. Writing for Civitas, he anticipated exactly this breaking news. John, a very good evening to you. Thank you, Professor. We charge immediately into the mechanics of what is happening. Judge Boasberg has issued a temporary restraining order and asking for more information. This has to do with the deportation of what we're told are Venezuelan nationals. We're also told that they are or suspect of being members of an international criminal organization called Aragua, originally out of Venezuela. We're also told that Venezuela may or may not take them back. Some of them, at least, certainly the ones the judge is concerned about, were sent to El Salvador, where there is said to be an arrangement between Bukele, the president of El Salvador, and the Trump administration to accept Venezuelan suspect gang members if Venezuela will not. I stopped there because the Alien Enemies Act is what the Trump administration is invoking. You have a new essay up that identifies this problem. Now we have this idea of state secrets privilege as well. And the Trump administration combating the courts. I want to begin by saying what I read from your essay is these contests were anticipated by the founders. I believe one of the founders in the Federalist paper said, ambition versus ambition, it brings the best out of us, or something to that effect. Good evening, Professor. Is this going to bring the best out in the courts and in the administration, this firefight? Good evening to you.
John, good evening, and it's great to be back with you. And you're right. The founders created the separation of powers so that the branches of government would fight, because they thought from the conflict between the president and the Congress and the courts, our liberties would be protected, that the government would really act in the public interest after they battled it out. And so what we're seeing today is the normal, I think, give and take, push and pull between the branches. Here you have a president who's doing his constitutional job, which is to protect the nation's security and faithfully execute the laws. Here he has claimed that a foreign drug cartel / terrorist group / gang that's intertwined with the government of Venezuela has sent hundreds, if not thousands, of people into the United States illegally to try to spread drugs, use violence, even take over parts of American towns and cities that we've seen on these terrible videos. On the other hand, the courts want to make sure everybody in the United States, whether they're citizens, green card holders, illegal aliens, get due process. under the 14th Amendment and the Fifth Amendment. The government's not allowed to take away your life, liberty, or property without due process. And so Judge Boasberg is saying, before you send all those people, all these TDA, Tren de Aragua people, overseas and kick them out of the country, we got to have some due process in the courts, don't we? Those two, right, competing incentives on the part of the courts and the president mean they are headed for a conflict. But what people should understand is that there's nothing wrong with the president and the courts fighting. It is the working out of what the founders designed.
Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. The president is Article 2. But I want to examine Article 3 because I learned from your essay how the courts think of themselves. James Boasberg is a district judge. There are 699 district judges, according to your reporting at Civitas, and they are trial judges. Then there are 179 appellate judges sitting on the appeals court. Right now, the Trump administration has recourse in those courts. How does it work, John? The district judge gives a temporary restraining order. How do you push back if you do?
Yes. So what happened here is Judge Boasberg got a lawsuit from some, I think, 5 or 6 lawyers representing 5 or 6 of the people who've been flown out of the country now. And Judge Boasberg issued a TRO, temporary restraining order, just designed to say, stop, freeze everything. Boasberg emphasized in his opinion, I'm not deciding President Trump's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. I'm not examining whether we're in a war or an invasion's taken place. I've not looked at even what the due process rights are yet, although he does say they have some. I'm just trying to stop everything, freeze it in place, so I get time to make a decision. Already, earlier this week, the government immediately appealed, as you're allowed to do, to what are called the circuit courts, which are the appeals courts that sit over the district courts. And the reason we have about 179 appeals judges. We have 13 circuit courts of appeals. There's one that's devoted solely to Washington, D.C.'s trial courts, where Judge Boasberg sits. They exist because trial judge makes mistakes. If trial judges never made mistakes, we wouldn't need to have all these fancy appellate judges. In fact, we wouldn't need a Supreme Court. So also, I want to say there's nothing wrong with President Trump's Justice Department going to the Circuit Court of Appeals and saying Judge Boasberg has acted beyond the power of a judge, beyond the power of a single judge. A trial judge can't stop nationwide our program to protect the nation's security by expelling these aliens under the Alien Enemies Act. That court heard arguments earlier this week. They're probably going to rule again quickly. This is, by the way, John, usually a case gets from the trial court to the appeals court. I clerked on that appeals court in Washington, D.C. for a great judge named Larry Silberman. It takes 1 or 2 years, usually, between your district court and your circuit court. So the fact that they're acting within a few days this is like warp speed. This is light speed for the circuit courts.
Does the representation of the Alien Act or this mention of state privilege, does that complicate the matter? Or is that all something that the courts are used to?
Oh, John, this is even compounds. It multiplies how hard this is for both sides. One is, and this is why Judge Boasberg tried to slow things down, is the government's claim under the Alien Enemies Act is unprecedented. Not because it's right or wrong, but because the Alien Enemies Act has only been used 3 times in our history: the War of 1812 and World Wars I and II. And in times when the court's vision of due process was much less robust than it is now. So it's fair to say there's really not much governing precedent. It's fair to say the courts really haven't thought about this before. And then, as you said, John, the state secrets privilege. So the Trump administration invoked a state secrets privilege, which itself is rarely used, not well understood, very few decisions at the Supreme Court about it. Basically, it says that the executive branch can try to protect certain national security secrets from being revealed in public, even to the point where they don't have to produce it in court, even produce it to a judge. So that's going to cause the district court enormous problems and the appeals courts, because one problem is, how do we tell if these people are even the right people, or if they were from Venezuela or not, or if they're really from the gang or connected to the gang, if the government won't provide any of that information to the court? What's a court to do when the government just doesn't give it the information it needs to decide the case?
Professor John Yoo, writing at the Civitas Institute about breaking news all around us. The Trump administration is defying, according to critics, and the district judge, James Boasberg, is demanding, according to news reports, information. That contest has happened before, and it's a great comfort to me to learn how has been resolved and the republic's still here. The first one is Thomas Jefferson taking on the courts and a man named Marshall. What happened, John?
Oh, John, I really love this stuff even more than what we're talking about today. And just, yeah, one reminder is that not only did the separation of powers as created by the framers create these incentives for the branches to fight, but they have fought a lot. President Trump was not the first person to attack the courts for their decisions. He's not even the first president to threaten impeachment. As you say, John, it started as early as Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson comes into office, sweeps the presidency of Congress. The Federalists, that was the party of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, swept out of Congress. John Adams is swept out of the presidency. And so one thing that Jefferson says is the last retreat, he calls it the redoubt of the Federalist Party, is now the judiciary. That is where they will fight me. And so Jefferson's party wanted to send a message. So they impeached a lower court judge from New Hampshire. But they had grounds for that because the guy was apparently a drunk on the bench. I don't know if that would get you impeached now, but it used to get you impeached back then. Then they moved on to higher game and they tried to impeach a justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Chase. And Justice Chase was given to making very intemperate remarks from the bench. They claimed that he would often attack the Jeffersonians, the party in power, which he probably wasn't supposed to do. But they primarily went after him because they didn't like the way the Supreme Court was deciding things in a way favorable to national power. Under the court of Chief Justice John Marshall, the court was very favorable to expanding federal power at the expense of the states. And so Justice Chase was tried. He was impeached, but he was acquitted by the Senate. And so ever since then, we've had this understanding, as Chief Justice Roberts said last week, and when he was responding to President Trump's impeachment attacks on Judge Boasberg, we have this tradition in our country now that we don't use impeachment. We don't consider high crimes and misdemeanors or bad behavior to include just getting something wrong, to include a judicial decision that you don't like.
My favorite president to defy the courts is Andrew Jackson, a man who was ornery right to the end. I always remember him threatening to hang the first man he found in the first tree he could find in South Carolina when they succeed.
Yes.
But he also fought the courts over something as dry as the National Bank. He defied the courts.
Yes.
And did he gain from this, or was there a negative consequence for his time in office and his successors?
The interesting thing about Jackson also, and this is why maybe he had a dubious view of judges because of that. It was before he was General Jackson, he himself was a lawyer and a state judge before he became a commander of the militia and then eventually a general and won the famous Battle of New Orleans. So there's a lot of argument about whether Jackson as president actually ever defied a direct judicial order. But he definitely took the position that as a president, he was not bound to follow the opinion of the Supreme Court. And this is in one of the most important Supreme Court cases ever, McCulloch versus Maryland, which upheld the ability of the United States to have a national bank. This was the predecessor to the Federal Reserve Bank. The Supreme Court upheld it. The bank came up for renewal. Congress passed it. So both the court and Congress thought it was constitutional. George Washington signed the first bill. James Madison signed the second bill. So previous presidents all thought it was constitutional. Jackson, however, vetoed the bill. And in his veto message, it's quite a striking document to read today. He said that he was the president, the head of a coordinate equal branch, and he had the right to interpret the Constitution too. And he said, just like I can't tell the judges what to think, the judges can't tell me what to think. And so I interpret the Constitution to say the bank is excessive federal power, and I'm going to veto it because I think it's unconstitutional.
The decision to defy the courts is not easily taken, so there are two more examples we have before us. I want to go to the FDR example and save Abraham Lincoln for a longer conversation in a moment. FDR won 1936 in a sweeping victory over the Republicans, over all the doubts about the New Deal, even over the courts. And it was his idea in early 37 to expand the number of people in the Supreme Court in order to overcome the resistance to pieces of the legislation that had been rejected. That was on the basis of an enormous endorsement by the public, and yet it failed. Why, John? Do we know yet why it failed?
This is very interesting too. So FDR, of course, saw his what we call the first New Deal struck down by the Supreme Court. Things like, we don't remember them today, but the National Recovery Act, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, things like this, which gave basically the president almost dictatorial powers of the entire economy to set prices, wages, everything, all struck down by the Supreme Court. As you say, FDR comes to the presidency in an unbelievable reelection majority where he has enough votes in both houses, over 2/3, he could get a constitutional amendments through.
We have a minute, John. A minute.
Yeah. Instead, he chooses to try to pack the courts. And as you say, John, it's still a historical dilemma. Did the Supreme Court change its mind, which it did, and upheld the rest of the New Deal under that threat, or was it going to do it anyway? But the interesting point is FDR lost. He didn't get his court packing bill through. He wanted to add 6 more justices to the court. And more importantly, in the next midterm elections in 1938, FDR's supported candidates for Congress all lost. And the ones who fought his court packing plan were all reelected.
Abraham Lincoln, it is early in the war, 1861, April, I believe, just after the outrage in South Carolina. We're looking at a general arresting a man suspect of being a Confederate or a rebel or rebellious or in some fashion a saboteur. His name is Merryman. The Chief Justice at the time is Taney, the same Roger Taney who was responsible for the Dred Scott decision of some years earlier under the Buchanan administration, the same Judge Taney who's suspect of having leaked the results of the vote to the president so he was prepared in his inaugural speech. That same Judge Taney. However, he wanted Merryman brought before his court. John, this is as dramatic as it gets. Lincoln knew that the judge demanded Merryman. What happened?
This is an amazing story. And in some respects, you think that it's all Taney's fault. Taney, by chance, he is from Baltimore, Maryland. He happens to be physically present in Baltimore, Maryland, when some people in Maryland, led by this fellow Merryman, tried to raise Confederate troops, essentially, and attack Union troops who were trying to get from the north to defend Washington. And in those days, there was a train line that stopped in Baltimore and the north of Baltimore. And then the troops would have to walk through downtown Baltimore to get to another train to get them to walk down to Washington. So the rebels were going to try to attack, and some troops had been harassed on that way. So Merryman is arrested by Union forces. He's held at Fort McHenry, the one about the Star-Spangled Banner. He's held there at Fort McHenry. Taney gets a writ for habeas corpus from Merryman's lawyer, and Taney issues a demand that Merryman be released from military detention and brought into court. The general refuses to obey. And so Taney issues an opinion called Ex parte Merryman, where he says, and you can hear echoes of this today in Judge Boasberg. He says, there's no declared war. Merryman is an American. He has the right to due process. He has the right to a writ of habeas corpus. I order him to be released. This general isn't listening to me, so I'm sending the writ to President Lincoln in Washington, D.C. Famously, Taney then appeared on the front steps of the Baltimore courthouse and said to a crowd, I think it was estimated 3,000 people, said that the American liberty was at stake and would crumble under dictatorship. Lincoln pretended he never got it, but he did say that he would respond to it. At the same time, he didn't release Merryman, nor did he release any of the other Confederate prisoners taken behind the lines in those early days of the Civil War. He gave a famous speech, a famous July 4th, 1861 special message to Congress, where he asked Congress to approve all the other extraordinary measures he took at the beginning of the Civil War, like raising an army and navy, paying them out of the treasury, imposing a blockade on the South, sending the troops into offensive operations into the South. Congress approved most of them, but Congress did not approve this detention, and it didn't approve holding them without access to the courts. And so I think historically, this is the only example where a president defied a direct judicial order.
Significant to me the way you've laid the case out. This threat in 1861 was existential to the republic, and Lincoln was acting in a fashion to defend his sworn constitutional duties. That is not now the case with Judge Boasberg. But, John, I confess, as an amateur reader, it's surprisingly familiar.
Yes.
And the court is demanding information. It can't actually demand the human beings who were sent to El Salvador, we believe, because they're not available. But he's demanding information. And the president's decision, including 3 cabinet officers, we're told in the news, is to refuse the court. That isn't quite the same as habeas corpus, but it is a direct challenge between a district judge and a president. And that's not existential, but it might be significant at the ballot box. Does that weigh in here? Are we just talking Constitution straight across?
No, John, you're quite right. There's a big difference between the Civil War and today, which is, as you say, the Civil War was an existential threat to our nation. This secession occurs and the country is done. We're no longer the Union. And Lincoln said he would make many comments like this. He would say, "Are all the laws but one, meaning everything else but habeas corpus, to fall just so we observe this one law?" Or he would say about the Constitution sometimes, of course, to save the life, sometimes you have to amputate the limb. And he would make these, but he never claimed that he did that. He never said, I am violating the Constitution to save the country. He always said, saving the Union is my chief duty as the president, right? That's my job. The highest constitutional imperative is to keep the country together. You can't have a constitution unless you have a union first. That, as you say, John, the drama of it, the high stakes are not present here. We are not under an existential threat from Venezuela or this gang. They are a national security threat, though. On the other hand, President Trump is not saying, I will defy the courts. He's got people around him and people out in public who are saying that, but he has said, I will obey judicial orders. I think what's going on is that the executive branch here, claiming state secrets, getting the cabinet officers involved, they are trying to say, you can't allow a single district judge, one of those, hundreds and hundreds of district judges you mentioned earlier, to be able to stop an important national security program nationwide. Maybe they can come to court and represent each individual for a writ of habeas corpus. But what you can't say is the president has to be stopped entirely in his efforts to protect the country from these foreign threats. That goes far beyond the judicial role.
The 18th century acts that are cited in these cases, in this case it's the Alien Enemies Act, does that weigh in a fashion that has not been present at the earlier episodes we were talking about? There is really an act of Congress to protect the country in a time of war. Even if it's not an existential war, it certainly is grounds to worry about national security.
Well, yes, this is very important difference because, for example, I was at the Justice Department after 9/11, and I was involved in some of the very early skirmishing with the courts about Guantanamo Bay. The Bush administration made similar arguments. We argued that the federal courts didn't have jurisdiction over Guantanamo Bay. We made similar arguments to President Trump. Courts in wartime would never get involved with telling the president how to deploy troops, how to move people around, how to get people out of the country who are enemies, and so on. But we didn't have the Alien Enemies Act then involved because it wasn't a declared war. Today, President Trump, I think, is using the Alien Enemies Act, even though it is unprecedented, even though it hasn't been used in over 70 years, because uh, it might allow for faster deportations. If he succeeds in court, he's going to say, I don't have to go through this one by one due process hearing for everyone we need to kick out of the country, and I don't have to reveal classified information in public. The problem for him, though, is that the Alien Enemies Act is narrow. It only applies during time of a declared war, and these are the statute's words, or an invasion, or some kind of what it calls predatory incursion, which sounds like pirate attacks, but it makes clear that all those three have to be committed by a foreign government. And only when a foreign government conducts an invasion, we're at war with, or some kind of incursion, can you then take all the citizens of that country and kick them out? The problem there is, we're not in declared war. So is this an invasion? The Trump White House says it is. I'm not sure the courts are going to agree.
And that is to be determined. So what we're going to turn to now, given that we've explicated as much as possible, the Boasberg matter is not resolved. We're in the middle of decisions being made as recently as minutes ago. So we're going to turn to why defying the courts is not a practical solution to an administration. Why? Because in this particular instance, the Roberts Court can be extremely helpful for the ambition that the Trump administration has set for itself. John, what is the role for Congress here, if there is one? There was a role for Congress in earlier decisions. We noted FDR was punished by Congress because of his overreach in packing the courts. Is it too late for Congress to get involved in this? You have quoted a couple of members of Congress who seem overheated on this matter.
John, you are so prescient because you anticipate an article I've written that will appear in National Review tomorrow morning saying, where's Congress? Why isn't Congress intervening? Because Congress could diffuse the whole problem. Congress could, for example, pass a law making clear that foreign terrorist groups and gangs like Tren de Agua are included with the Alien Enemies Act. That would make this very easy. It could set out the process for kicking these people out of the country so that courts don't make up due process procedures that ask for too much classified information to be made in public. I think Congress can also play an important role, I think, to calm down people who are calling for impeachment of lower court judges, and hopefully not, but may even call for the impeachment of Supreme Court justices, because it's Congress that has the sole power of impeachment. Only Congress gets to decide whether someone's committed treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, which is the phrase used in the Constitution as the impeachment standard. Only Congress can decide whether to convict a judge of impeachment. In fact, the Supreme Court has said decisions on impeachment are unreviewable. Only Congress decides. Only Congress interprets the Constitution on impeachment. So I think Congress could do two things here. Congress could make Trump cases stronger for using the Alien Enemies Act and for kicking these terrible, like nobody wants these people out on the street, but kicking these terrible gang members out of the country. But at the same time, maybe they could do something for the courts by saying impeachment is not the right avenue to go. The right way to go is for the Trump administration to appeal through the regular process, take its lumps, but also take its wins.
You identify why it would be wise, I believe you use the catchphrase common sense, for the Trump administration to follow through on its court filing. but not to fight this in some unusual fashion. The Roberts Court, your measure, John, has the Roberts Court been obliging to the Trump administration, or is it in a hostile mode? How do you see it now?
This is what's puzzling about these impeachment attacks on the judiciary, is that the Roberts Court, which sits at the top of all these district judges and circuit judges, I would say is the most friendly court, the most welcoming court to arguments of executive power of the last 100 years. We haven't seen one like this from since before FDR's attack on the courts. Many of the arguments that Trump is making for other areas we haven't talked about, like freezing spending, reducing the workforce, the federal workforce, right? Are the power to direct the Justice Department, the power to control all law enforcement in the federal government. These are arguments that come from the Roberts Court itself. It's the Roberts Courts over the last 25 years, 20 years, sorry, 2020, that has been pushing to expand the power of the president. You see in decisions like last year's immunity decision, finding presidents are immune from criminal prosecution. John Roberts wrote the decision. John Roberts is the one who said in that opinion, the president is the head of the executive branch. Everyone who works in the executive branch is his assistant. He controls all the enforcement of federal law. That's one of the most powerful statements on behalf of a president ever made in the Supreme Court. It's the Roberts Court that has expanded the president's power to fire subordinate officers and to try to bring all these crazy number of independent agencies under the direct control of the White House. And what puzzles me is that if Trump appeals in the normal process, makes his arguments on behalf of an energetic executive, this is the best home court advantage he could ever have. It doesn't make sense to me to attack that court when it's intellectually, maybe not politically, but intellectually on your side.
John Roberts' position, he's the Chief Justice, I understand, and he delivered his thoughts to the president most recently. What is his relationship to a district court judge, Boasberg? Do they talk? Do they confer? Is it a superior officer to an inferior officer? How does it actually play itself out?
It's an interesting question, John, and I don't think it's really written about. I had the honor to clerk in that DC circuit, which is the one that's hearing the appeal of Judge Boasberg right now. And I had the distinct honor to clerk for Justice Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. So I got to see this relationship close hand. And you would be surprised. When it comes to cases, they don't talk at all. The Supreme Court and the lower courts don't talk in person, don't talk on phone. They don't communicate other than written documents. The only thing the Supreme Court will see from the trial judge, from Judge Boasberg, when this case gets to the Supreme Court, is his written opinion. Now, they may know each other, they may talk socially or professional gatherings, because they are all these judges that we're talking about in this case are in Washington, D.C. But they will never talk about the case outside of the formal process. Part of that is so that I think the litigants, the public knows why judges decide things. I think this is unique. This is not the way things work in the executive or legislative branches. Other branches I've also worked for, there's a lot of informal discussion. It all works on informal discussion. It's not so the courts. In fact, the Supreme Court is a funny institution itself. Even though you have 9 justices in the same building, you rarely see them talking to each other one-on-one. They also communicate by memos all the time in written documents. And so you see a lot of things worked out on paper with a record, which is, I think, it's a protection for the courts too, because you really do see their real reasons for why they decide things.
Were you surprised then that John Roberts made his opinion known right now about impeachment not being a good course to follow? It sounds as if he did not have to do that.
Oh, yes. I actually thought it might have been a mistake. I think in this case, discretion might have been a little bit better course. Because one thing is, the founders give the justices, all federal judges, lifetime tenure, because that's how you insulate them from politics. They don't have to be accountable for their decisions through reelection. So our ideal is that they shouldn't care about what people are saying about them in the press. They shouldn't care about what's going on in politics. Yes, people can call for their impeachment. Yes, President Trump can attack them. Judges should just keep their heads down and do their job. And in fact, while Chief Justice Roberts can't do anything one way or about impeachment, he can solve this problem that the Trump administration has with individual trial judges stopping all of the government's activities. They have a case pending before them right now that asks them to review, I think, 3 different district judges who have stopped his birthright citizenship order. And he's up there right now saying to the Trump's up there at the Supreme Court right now saying, stop this practice. Don't let these trial judges be able to stop the entire federal government. Create an accelerated process for us to get up to the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Roberts could, I think, spend more of his time looking inside his own house rather than worrying so much about what's going on in the political maelstrom that's Washington, D.C.
John Yoo, Distinguished Visiting Professor, School of Civic Leadership at the University of Texas at Austin. Emanuel Heller, Chair in Law, Distinguished Professor of Law, University of California at Berkeley, a Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the Civitas Institute. I'm John Batchelor.